Welcome back to It's Haunted, What Now? I'm your host, Lainey. It's always been a question and mystery why ghosts and spirits choose to stay behind, to haunt or wander the earth after death. Is it unfinished business or a strong will to remain on the physical plane? Do some of them simply wish to stay close to family? Today's episode is full of stories involving these questions, and ones that raise even more. Okay, ready to get spooked? Our first story comes from Tomber-De-Sommeil, who was simply a young teen, curious about the family attic. This happened when I was 13 years old, spending the Christmas holidays abroad in a rural part of France. My parents are French, and I was born in France, but I grew up in Canada since I was 2 years old. We spent a lot of summer and winter holidays there. I was staying with relatives of mine in their house when this occurred, which was a very old farmhouse. One particular day, my cousins and I decided to stay inside for the day because it was snowing heavily. We spent most of the day just wasting time and horsing around. A little later in the afternoon, my older cousin and I went up into the attic together because she was looking for something, and I followed her because I was curious to see the attic. There was a lot of stuff up there that interested me, like old books and some antique items. Once she found what she needed, I asked her if it was okay if I stayed up there for a while to look around. She giggled and said something to the effect of, "Why, it's just a bunch of old shit up here, but yeah, if you want to." I spent about half an hour walking around looking at stuff until I happened upon some old book from the early 1800s that seemed intriguing to me, because I was, or am, a bit of a literature nerd. I sat down and read it for a little while before deciding that I wanted to take it back to my bedroom to read every night before bed. When I closed the book and went to stand up, my gaze immediately shifted over to a woman who was sitting in a chair on the left side of the room. This briefly startled me at first and made me gasp because I had never seen her before, and I didn't hear her come into the attic. She was wearing very old clothing, had long blonde hair, and she was quite pretty. She looked like she was somewhere between 25 and 30 years old. She didn't look solid though, and it's hard to explain exactly what I mean by that. She wasn't like the stereotypical Hollywoodized, translucent ghost, but she had a certain opaqueness about her that tells you on an instinctual level that you're not looking at a living biological entity. She smiled and said to me, "Désolé si je vous ai fait peur, ma chérie," or "Sorry if I scared you, dear." And sorry if I butchered that French. At this point, I didn't feel any fear or apprehension at all. This apparition radiated a kind, warm, and positive energy that I could somehow feel right down to my core, and I felt safe in her presence. It was a very brief encounter. Around 5 seconds after she spoke, she stood up, walked about 7 feet to the right of the room, and faded away mid-stride. I just silently sat there, dumbfounded, for a few minutes. When I left the attic, I was hesitant to tell anybody about what I saw, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. A few days later, I decided to privately ask my youngest cousin about it. She was 8 years old, and I figured that younger kids are usually a little more open to things like this, and less judgmental than teenagers and adults. To my surprise, she was quite candid about it. When I asked her if she had ever seen a lady who appears out of nowhere, she responded, "Do you mean the blonde lady?" When I nodded, she then said something to the effect of, "Yeah, I see her sometimes. It's okay, she's nice." She told me that she had been seeing her since she was about 5 years old. We didn't really talk much more about it, and I didn't tell anybody else about what I had seen. It's something that will always vividly stick in my memory because it was so surreal, and I can still visualize her face when I close my eyes. I never did find out who she is. The fact that the farmhouse was very old would lead me to believe she was most likely a person who lived there at one time. I don't think that all ghosts are forlorn spirits yearning for something. I have read stories about some that come across as harmless and seem happy. Maybe some of them occasionally enjoy visiting places where there are a lot of fond memories for them. You see, I agree with you wholeheartedly. Not all spirits are malevolent or tortured souls. I know you never found out who the woman was, but I'm curious if she could be a distant relative of yours, since the farmhouse did belong to your family. Although I'm not sure how long the house has been in your relative's possessions, but maybe it's something interesting to look into. Now, our next story comes from ChilledBonesWrites, and they bring us our second story about a desperately accepted job offer with undisclosed duties. After months of searching for a job with no luck, I fell upon an ad for an RN position at a local prison. Feeling somewhat desperate at this point, I submitted an application. To my delight, it was accepted, and before long, I was the new RN. One day during morning break, when I was still fairly new, I agreed to stay at the nurses' station and finish up some of the charts while the other nurses took a break. I sat down in the chair and was glancing between the chart in front of me and the computer screen, entering in some patient details. Suddenly, I felt like the chair I was sitting on was tugged. It was so slight, however, so I was able to shrug it off as maybe I'd kicked it with my foot or possibly I'd felt it move, but it hadn't. Nonetheless, I went back to typing and charting. A few minutes later, my chair moved again. This time, it was so pronounced that it pulled me back about a foot. I turned around thinking one of the nurses was playing a joke on me, only to find no one there. My skin was starting to crawl with an uneasy feeling, but I pushed myself back in front of the keyboard and started typing again. Later on in the day, I checked on some empty rooms and made sure their supplies were fully stocked for the next round of patients. I was bent over looking in a drawer, counting out some of the supplies when, from behind me, it sounded like someone had actually sat down on the bed in the room. To describe it better, the bed squeaked, and one of the armrails made a clanging noise as if someone or something had bumped it. I whipped around and searched the room for anyone, but I was alone. Annoyed and obviously frightened, I continued counting items, but with my body turned sideways so I could glance at the rest of the room. Nothing else happened. I shut the cabinet and was walking out of the room when something pulled my attention to the bed. It looked indented as if someone had recently sat on it, and as I looked on, I saw the blanket on the top move ever so slightly, as if someone were adjusting themselves on it. I hightailed it out of there in slight shock. Did I just see a ghost? Was that what it was? My very last experience before I actually quit was when, again, I was charting. The other nurses were at their morning break and I was again sitting on the chair. I heard footsteps coming down the hall, and knowing the nurses had barely just left, I was doubtful it was one of them. I stood up and peered around the corner, still hearing the footsteps. There was no one there, but the footfalls continued to echo on. I stood there for a moment, trying to decide if I'd go investigate or ignore it since there was no obvious culprit. I decided to sit back down and try to ignore the sounds. As I sat in the chair and begged my fingers to concentrate on typing, the footsteps gained on the nurse's station, where I was. They continued until they seemed to stop directly in front of the counter. With all the courage I could muster, I stood up and peered over the counter at the floor. No one. I took a few steps backward, then slowly sat back in my chair and just stared ahead of me at the wall. I could not understand why these things were happening. Were they something that happened all the time, or was it just me? I made it another 3 weeks before I thankfully found another job. I never asked anyone if something similar had happened to them because I was too scared they would think I was crazy. But if I had to guess, I'd say that an inmate that died in the medical ward is hanging around, unwilling to move on. Now you see, I'm curious if these experiences were only happening to you. I really wish you would have asked people. You'd think that the other more tenured nurses would have warned you about it or had any stories to tell the new hire, just to kind of scare them or spook them out. But let me tell you, you're much braver than I for sticking it out as long as you did, because I would have been long gone after having the chair pulled out. Our third story comes from Light VI, who had an experience with the paranormal or possibly the extraterrestrial. Almost a year ago, I was with my ex in the driveway of her house at 2 a.m. eating burgers, just sitting in the car and having a chat. Nothing special, really. I noticed a movement in the corner of my eye and don't even bother looking because the neighborhood is full of cats, so random darting shapes in the peripheral vision is totally normal. As time passes and our conversation continues, I notice that she is occasionally looking at something up the driveway, and I finally ask, "See any cats?" She has a rabbit in her yard and even a cage, so she worries for him often since the cats like to sit outside of his cage and bother him even when it's covered with blankets. She gives an odd response of, "Oh yeah, I think I saw something in the driveway." She was incredibly nearsighted and it was dark, but I overlooked the odd behavior and we continued to eat and talk. Eventually, I notice a much larger shape move in the corner of my eye and can't help but look back and over my shoulder to see what it is, hoping there aren't people near the car at such a late hour. Admittedly, it was a bit of a sketchy neighborhood. What I saw just outside the backseat window was no person, however. What I can't do is describe its appearance properly. No matter how long it sat still, my brain couldn't fully process what I was looking at. It was just a dark, shadowy figure roughly the size of a person, maybe 5 feet 6 inches. I think it had a head and a body as well, but I can't say for certain. It was like looking at a real-life, censored object, and it was staring back at me. A formless, spectral thing that immediately rang every alarm bell in my head. My eyes immediately filled with tears. My stomach dropped, and I felt like I was getting pulled into its gaze. As soon as I realized it was blocking the view of the tree behind it, my fear grew even worse. Any hope that it was a person immediately crumbled away when it moved. It was a sort of flickering motion, as though it went from existing to not existing, from point A to point B extremely fast. Point B was behind my car, where it then stayed for another second, before flickering out of sight completely. I turned to my ex-girlfriend, and she had a shocked look on her face and was looking at something else in another direction. She turned to me and said, "You can see them too, right?" Realizing that I wasn't hallucinating and that there was more than one prompted me to say, "Yeah, let's go inside." We got out of the car, and when I turned to watch her close her door, another figure flickered past her, maybe 15 feet behind. At that point, I could physically feel 4 separate, anomalous things bearing down on us. I could feel the pressure of them, and my body was producing ungodly amounts of adrenaline. We made it inside, and I immediately started saying, "Holy shit, we just saw that. That shit is real. Was that spirits or aliens or..." Before she cut me off and said, "Don't talk about it. Stop talking about it." We didn't talk about it for days, but my questions burned because what I saw was so profound that my whole stance on everything was changed. Eventually, she did talk about it, and confirmed that there were 3 or 4 things harassing us that night. She didn't know why. I didn't know why. For the next few months, it felt like something in my mind shifted and changed a little bit. I started becoming more perceptive of weird shit like this and became more paranoid. I even got effed with many times, and it was driving me insane. That's another story, so for now, I'll leave whoever hears this with the first real and insane stuff I ever experienced. Of course, the first thought I had was the paranormal, since that's what we deal with mostly around here. But when you later thought it could have been aliens, I really stopped to think that maybe that was a possibility. Normally, we don't hear very many stories of spirits acting in such a strange and intelligent way, like they were just messing with you. Adding that there were more than one really makes this experience even more strange, and I definitely wanted our listeners to hear it. So please send us more of your stories. We'd love to hear them. Kfcpanicattack brings us our next story about their grandparents' odd house with an equally odd room and experience. In June of 2008, my family moved to a new house. It was my grandparents', and my dad got it after they died. It was built in the 1950s and, by those standards, was a mansion. It is quite a big house with 3 levels, the main floor, a basement, and upstairs. My sister and I had the biggest room as we would be sharing it. The bedroom we had was up the stairs and all the way down the hallway, so it was hard to go up or down without being heard. But while we were in our room, no one downstairs could hear us, and we couldn't hear them unless they were yelling very loud. While moving in, I was about 4 and my sister was about 6. Because of this, our parents helped us bring up our toys, and we were told to stay in our room. We didn't want to help move in, so we were okay with it. My grandparents had a weird style. So the walls of our room were painted teal and the floor was a mossy green carpet. It was shockingly cold in there for June, and there were no blinds on the window. There was also no light installed in the room, but there was in the closet. To put it simply, it had a very weird vibe. Me and my sister, who I will be calling Jay for the remainder of this story, bundled up and started to play with our dolls. Our dolls were her prized possessions. We probably had 30, and the collection continued to grow. However, none of our other siblings cared for them, so Jay and I almost always played alone. We were playing in the closet because it had a light and more controlled temperature, when suddenly there were 2 girls in the doorway of our closet. They looked normal enough, and around our same ages, so when they asked if they could play, we said yes. They told us they lived in the house before we did, which I didn't realize was possible at the time. After only about a minute of playing, they asked if they could tell us a story. Me and Jay wanted to make some new friends, so we said yes. They both showed their arms to us, and they had 3 massive scars from elbow to wrist. They told us they had gotten them from Bloody Mary. Jay and I had never heard of Bloody Mary, so they explained her to us. They said she was a queen with a thirst for blood, and if you went into a bathroom mirror and said her name 3 times, she would appear. Jay didn't believe a word of this, so we went to the bathroom. Jay told me she thought their scars were from a cat, and I had nothing to worry about. We turned the lights off, but because there was a big window in the bathroom, there was still a lot of light. Finally, I calmed down enough to chant, so we did. Nothing happened. Not a chill, or a face, or a scratch, nothing. Jay and I laughed it off and left the bathroom. The girls, who had been standing in front of the door, were no longer there. We figured they'd gone back to our room, so we went back in, and there was no one. The stairs were very creaky and loud, and you can hear them very well through the bathroom door, so they couldn't have gone back downstairs while we were in there. They were just gone. Our parents called us downstairs for dinner. We had already forgotten that something weird had happened, so we didn't ask. In fact, we had forgotten all about it for a long time, until a few years ago. We finally realized it was weird, so we decided to ask who those girls were. Our family was confused, but we didn't know why. We asked again, and what they said sent a chill down my spine. No one went upstairs after you guys, and definitely no girls lived here before us. Needless to say, I was glad I had a new room at that point. We still live in the house though, and weird noises still happen all the time. Okay, I'll admit I was holding my breath when you both went into the bathroom to try the Bloody Mary game. And I was like, here it comes. And I really thought you were going to have an encounter there and was so relieved that you didn't. Now, those two girls were super mysterious, and I'm curious what they really wanted from the two of you. Were they trying to do something nefarious, like possess your bodies, or have you harm your sister or do something like that? I have no clue, and I'm glad you never found out. Our final story comes from EmyraldNightshade, whose nighttime drive had an extra passenger inside. Many moons ago, when I was in my late 20s, I was a waitress and worked mostly nights. I had 2 small kids, and we lived in a pretty big place with my aunt. Yes, the very same. My car had broken down, and H, my aunt, was taking me to and from work. The road wasn't too long, but it was curvy and narrow and very dark at night, even when the moon was bright. The trees were close to the road and grew in an almost tunnel throughout most of the road. This one particular night, it was after midnight by the time we were heading home. H is driving, and I'm in the passenger seat, counting out my tips. I heard some rustling coming from the back floorboard and asked H about it. At first, she hadn't heard anything, but eventually she did. Our initial thought was kittens. We had small kittens at the house, and they were bad about jumping into the vehicles anytime a door was open. We pulled over to the side of the road when we came to a spot that was wide enough so we could have a look. The car was a 2-door, so we had to push the seats up to look in the back. There were some newspapers on the back floorboard, and it was these that we heard rustling. We picked everything up, but didn't find anything. Our next thought was the breeze from our windows. We had them down maybe an inch or 2, and maybe they were disturbing the papers. No big deal, right? So we got back in the car and continued on. When we start hearing it again, it was quite a bit louder and bigger somehow. This is much more than a breeze, but we try to ignore it until something starts hitting the back of my seat. Not real hard, almost like a small kid lightly kicking my seat. I look at H and said, "Something is hitting my seat." She thought I was trying to pull her leg and didn't believe me. Then it got hard enough that she could actually see me bouncing from the impact. So I, being the not very smart person that I am, decide to unbuckle my seatbelt and take a peek in the back to see what the F was going on. No one ever accused me of having all my dogs barking. H slowed down a bit. Remember, we can't get off the road again. There's no room. And I'm on my knees on the passenger seat, facing the back. The back of my seat is still being banged on, but I couldn't see anything. I leaned over the back of the seat to get a better look when, bang! The seat was hit so hard, the locking mechanism that keeps it in place was broken. The whole seat was rammed up into the dash and it slung me into the dashboard. Hard. I was split open behind my right ear and ended up in the front floorboard. Of course, H hit the brake and we were stopped in the middle of the road, which was at least as dangerous as what was going on inside the car. I just scrambled back into the seat and buckled my belt and told H to frickin' floor it. Get me home. We were just a couple miles from home and we took those curves like a race car. As soon as we roared into the driveway, we jumped out and ran to the house. If I'm not mistaken, H didn't even turn the motor off. It may have just ran out of gas sitting there. I do know that I didn't shut the door, and H swears that neither did she, but they were both closed and the doors locked the next morning. Luckily, she had an extra key, but my happy butt never got in that car again. Hey, same, my happy butt would have never gotten in that car again either. I have absolutely no words to say about what could have possibly been back there kicking your seat. But anything that has the ability to physically hurt you is a huge nope from me and the rest of us here at It's Haunted What Now. Since this experience was many moons ago, I hope you're doing well and never had any more crazy experiences like that ever again. Well, that does it for this episode. If you'd like to submit your own personal spooky tale to be read on the show, head to hauntedpod.com and click on the link to submit your story. You can also email me at hauntedpod@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a positive review on Apple Podcasts or your podcast player of choice. It really does help us out. You can find us on Twitter at podcast_haunted, Instagram at It's Haunted What Now, or at hauntedpod.com. Production assistance provided by Olivia Homsley. Writing assistance by Sherilyn Reyes. The official composer for the show is Nico at We Talk of Dreams. Check him out on Twitter at We Talk of Dreams or wetalkofdreams.com. Audio engineering is provided by Ches at Gray Multimedia. Until next time. Did you hear that?